Well, we've come to week 10. This week's section of Ecclesiastes really embodies the difficulty of teaching wisdom literature. Because there's no unifying, it's not one body of text, a line of reasoning from beginning to end. What Koheleth has presented us with here in this section is his commendations of wisdom and warnings against folly in proverb form, the traditional form of wisdom literature. And none of it is particularly earth-shaking or exciting, but just good sense. So mostly what we're going to do today is I'm just going to have to give you my impressions of, because I've read in several different commentaries to see what other people do with this, and you wouldn't believe the gymnastics people will go to try to make this one unified section. So we begin at the beginning, which for us is chapter 9, verse 13. I have also seen this example of wisdom under the sun, and it seemed great to me. There was a little city with few men in it, and a great king came against it and besieged it, building great siege works against it. But there was found in it a poor, wise man, and he by his wisdom delivered the city. Yet no one remembered that poor man. But I say that wisdom is better than might, though the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. Now, what we have here is a generic anecdote, and people have pointed out different historical examples of this. One commentator brought up a story of Alexander the Great, who was going to destroy a small city, and he was determined that no one was going to change his mind on that. But in the city, apparently his former mentor was living, and he came out, and Alexander said to him, "Oh, no, I will not do anything that you ask me to do." And of course, the mentor, being a wise man, said, "Well, then I beg you to destroy this city." And Alexander's like, nicely played. We don't know if that's a real story or if it's just one of those legends that grows up around legendary figures. But we do have an example of something like this in 2 Samuel chapter 20. After the brazen treachery of David's son, trying to take over the kingship, and the king comes back, but there's a quarrel between the men of Israel and the men of Judah, and a fellow named Sheba, son of Bichri, tries to take advantage of this to draw off the men of Israel after him to become probably their king. And so David sends his men after this Sheba, saying that, he's going to be doing more damage to us than Absalom did. So they chase him all the way to a city called Abel of Beth-maachah, and they besiege the city, and they are going to tear down the walls to overthrow it. And here's what we have in 2 Samuel 20, starting in verse 16. Then a wise woman called from the city, listen, tell Joab, come here that I may speak to you. And he came near her, and the woman said, are you Joab? He said, I am. She said to him, listen to the words of your servant. He said, well, I'm listening. And then she said, they used to say in former times, let them but ask counsel at Abel. And so they settled a matter. I am one of those who are peaceable and faithful in Israel. You seek to destroy a city that is a mother in Israel. Why will you swallow up the heritage of the Lord? And he said, oh, far be it from me, far be it that I should swallow up or destroy. That's not true. But a man of the hill country of Ephraim, called Sheba, son of Bichri, has lifted up his hand against King David. Give him up alone, and I'll withdraw from the city. And she says to Joab, we'll throw you his head over the wall. So she goes to the people in her wisdom, and they execute Sheba, son of Bichri, take his head and lob it over the wall to Joab. So happy ending, I guess, for most. But this example of one wise voice in a time of trouble, when he says, wisdom is better than might, although a poor man's wisdom is despised and his words are not heard generally. I found it interesting. One commentator, Charles Wesley, actually, when he talks about this, and he points out that we have a responsibility that even though the wisdom of God may be despised, and even though it may seem the words aren't heard, we do have a responsibility to speak that wisdom, all the more in times of trouble. That even one may deliver a great number, if you choose to set aside any sense of personal wrong. This guy could have said, you know what? What's it to do with me? As long as I can save myself and the people I approve of, why should I bother for you people? I mean, you ignore me most of the time, and then you drag me out when there's trouble. No, but he didn't. And that made me think, right? We, it's just, human nature really is that petty and vindictive that we would only speak to save those of whom we approve, or those who approve of us, like those who treat us nicely. But that's not what God did. He, in his wisdom, though he was rich, the word became flesh and took on our sin. And so some people, uh, they like to allegorize this story as like the city being the church and the one wise man being Christ. But honestly, it's just an example of the responsibility you have, even in a crowd of people who despise you, to speak the words that will save. And he goes on, right, to kind of branch out on this theme by saying the words of the wise heard in quiet are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. I don't know if you tend to watch legislative affairs, like the actual sessions and whatnot, but they can get pretty wound up. Not nearly as bad as if you ever watched UK Parliament. Sometimes that's actually funny in a sad way. People get really wound up and they just like they're shouting each other down, and but wisdom does not shout down other people. In fact, wisdom tends to be really quiet. The shouting, it doesn't really accomplish a whole lot in the end. And he adds, wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good, which is an interesting transition then into chapter 10, where he uses this analogy of dead flies making a perfumer's ointment give off a stench, right? Now you have to remember, well, I mean, we know spring comes, so do the flying insects. And if you are doing something delicate like creating a perfume, the last thing you want are little dead insects floating in it. It's not going to smell very good after that. But the whole point is, it doesn't take a whole lot of contamination to ruin a whole batch. And so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. You can spend a lifetime building a reputation for wisdom and honor, and one slip can ruin the whole thing. That's all people will then remember you for. And this, of course, when you're in New Testament terms, will remind you, I hope, of the advice. I'm pretty sure it's Paul. I should have looked this one up beforehand. But when he says to avoid even the appearance of evil, you see, wisdom is not a cover. If it doesn't go all through, right, it makes a horrible facade. Wisdom and folly are irreconcilable. They cannot coexist. Hence, right, chapter 10, verse 2, a wise man inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. Right? If you're a lefty, you know right-handed people rule the world. And right, the direction to the right, my right or left, but anyway, has always in scripture been associated with strength, skill, favor, the one who sits at the right hand of God, right? That is the highest position of honor. But regardless of directionality, wisdom and folly are headed in opposite directions. They cannot live in the same person. So those who aim to be wise do well to remember that even a little folly will pull them back from their goal. And no amount of wisdom will cover folly. Because folly has a way of making itself known. And we're not talking, I just want to reiterate, in wisdom literature, when we're talking about folly, we are not talking about stupidity or necessarily lack of knowledge. There is a certain amount of lack of understanding bound up in it, but we're talking about moral folly, having a lack of moral sense. And this really proclaims itself. At verse 3, even when the fool walks on the road, he lacks sense and says to everyone that he is a fool. Now, there's this, I don't know if you've ever watched the Kenneth Branagh Much Ado About Nothing, but there's a character in there who is sort of the constable, the police officer of the play, and he is an idiot. That's just what his role is in the play. And while he is examining suspected criminals at one point, one of them gets so frustrated with his stupidity that he calls him an ass. And he's like, did you just call me? And he goes over to everybody else. He's like, though it be not written down, never forget that I am an ass. It's like, yes, everyone knows that, dearie. Everyone knows. Because of the way you carry yourself, the way you speak, the way you act, everyone knows. It doesn't have to be written down. When a fool walks on the road, his lack of sense proclaims to everyone. And a gap in one's moral sense will show itself. And then, yeah, I want you to skip verses 4 through 7, right? And I don't know why they alternate like this, but jump to verse 8. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stones is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. If the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength. But wisdom helps one to succeed. If the serpent bites before it's charmed, there's no advantage to the charmer. Right? So we have a series here of accidents, but probably preventable accidents. And certain commentators see here an example of this is what happens when folly is left to itself, right? A lack of precautions. Now, it's not, unusual that a person who takes precautions still has an accident, but that part in verse 10 is kind of the key to all of this. Wisdom helps with success, right? But folly is the picture of one who doesn't maintain his tools and as a result just decides he's going to swing harder. Now, I've been told that it's more dangerous to use dull knives in cooking than sharp ones. And I've had some experience in that direction. A dull knife doesn't cut in the direction you want it to necessarily. Whereas a sharpened knife will go exactly where you direct it. You think about these examples of accidents, and then think about the kinds of incidents that people come into, not necessarily by their intention, but because they didn't adhere to the ways of God's wisdom. All the things that happen that they want you to feel sorry for them, and yet you can't help thinking, but if you'd only done this. I think of incidents like stories of infidelity, and then the marriage breaks up, and the children are pulled every which way. And you think, that could have been prevented. with wisdom, to acknowledge where the dangers are morally, where your weaknesses are. You think of addictions. Addiction itself might be, treated as a disease, but it had a beginning that didn't have to happen. Of course, there's no point in saying that to a person once they're already in the pit or bitten by the serpent or, took a knock on the head from a badly split log, that kind of, it's no, but you have to remember, folly and wisdom go in opposite directions. And to encourage people to wisdom, to be that voice, that one quiet voice, encouraging wiser course of action. Not out of judgment, like, oh, yes, I'm so much better than you, but out of warning of these consequences. You know which way folly ends up. You see, the words of a wise man's mouth win him favor. And sometimes you talk about this in terms of, in wisdom literature, in terms of royal favor. That, the wise and the skilled will serve before kings, right? But if you think about wisdom as an attempt to protect oneself and others from the consequences of folly, even if they don't win you popularity, there will be some who listen, who heed the warning, avoid the accident, and will then view you with favor. Because the lips of a fool consume him. You think about how many times we, what is the saying, open mouth, insert foot. But it's not just, faux pas or our embarrassment. Honestly, says the beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. I think of examples like Oscar Wilde or Friedrich Nietzsche, who really did end in rather poor mental state. Multiplying words of folly without moral direction, encouraging others to plunge into the same shame that they do. You shouldn't underestimate the contagion of folly. Makes me think of 2 Peter, when he talks about the false prophets that come up, the false teachers who bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing upon themselves swift destruction, and also those who follow them. He describes them like irrational animals, creatures of instinct, born to be caught and destroyed, blaspheming about matters of which they are ignorant. and that they will also be destroyed in their destruction. They entice unsteady souls. They have hearts trained in greed. And then speaking loud boasts of folly. This is 2 Peter 2, verse 18. They entice by sensual passions of the flesh those who are barely escaping from those who live in error. They promise them freedom, but they themselves are slaves of corruption. For whatever overcomes a person, to that he is enslaved. For if after they have escaped the defilements of the world through the knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they are again entangled in them and overcome, and the last state has become worse for them than the first. It would have been better for them never to have known the way of righteousness than, after knowing it, to turn back from the holy commandment delivered to them. And this is where he uses those colorful proverbs. The dog returns to its own vomit, and the sow, after washing herself, returns to wallow in the mire. The lips of a fool consume him and everyone who listens to him. It's contagious. And he multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him. Another of Koheleth's pet peeves about not knowing what is to be, what is to come after us. And yet the fool goes on and, he's plenty ready to make predictions about the future and say, well, this is how this is going to be, even though he doesn't know. Right? He describes a fool's work as the toil of a fool wearies him. It's like he doesn't even know the way to the city. Now, in those days, it was really important to have a city nearby where you could go. It's not just as a center of commerce, but it was also a place of security. A walled city was about the only place you didn't have to worry about predators, four-legged or two-legged, where there was some form of law enforcement. He says, fool don't even know the way back to the city. I'm like, oh, he's out wandering, happy-go-lucky out in the wilderness, I guess. But more than just this generic wisdom versus folly, Koheleth is concerned in this section about folly in high places. And you think about what it does, this moral foolishness, just in everyday generic life. What about in those who control the course of a country, of a city? Back up to verses 4 through 7. If the anger of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offenses to rest, right? This should echo back a few chapters where he was talking about, right? When the king is upset with you. Don't panic. In this case, it was stay calm if you've offended someone powerful. And we're back right to that words of wise heard in quiet. And yet, that's kind of an ideal situation. If a wise person serves a just and wise ruler, then any offenses or misunderstandings can be worked out. But Kohelet says there is an evil I've seen under the sun, as it were, an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in many high places. and the rich sit in a low place. Right. From our point of view, right, Democratic Republic and all that sort of thing, we think, oh, hey, the rich being put down, we like that. But in this sense, he's talking about the people who actually have the time and the resources to study wisdom, to have knowledge, education, are being, and he kind of clarifies this in verse 7, they're being supplanted by slaves. Now, not going into, of course, the whole uh, concept and history, the burden of history of slavery, but think about what happens when someone in power starts to favor those who are unqualified to share that power. I actually was thinking when I was reading this of Esther, where the king was giving favor to Haman, while Mordecai was a wise and really shrewd man, was sitting outside the gate, just almost like a beggar. It was unfitting for the king to favor Haman. Why did he do it? Because Haman knew the right words to say. But he was the sort who would slaughter an entire people and think, well, as long as I just pay the slave value of them into the king's treasury, that's all right. The sort who would, out of blind vindictiveness, seek to kill a man who had saved the king's life and was the guardian, surrogate father of one of the king's favorite queens. I mean, it's just like there are times when folly is set in high places, and those who are unqualified for power end up with power. And when you skip down to verse 16, he says, woe to you, O land, when your king is a child, is immature, is lacking in knowledge and in judgment, and your princes feast in the morning. But happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of the nobility, and your princes feast at a proper time for strength and not for drunkenness. And the following, it sounds a little out of place until you think about this as, well, what if this is just a continuation of that thought? Through sloth, the roof sinks in. Through indolence, the house leaks. This is just a general rule, right? If you don't take care of your property, it's going to decay. But think about this. He just said, right? Woe to you, O land, when your king is immature and your princes carouse from the time they wake up in the morning, basically. What happens to a country ruled by these types of authorities, right? You could say the roof sinks in and the house leaks. Because bread is made for laughter, for good cheer, and wine gladdens life, and like this money answers everything. It means you can pay for just about anything. But you remember, what did he already say about your bread and your wine and your clothes? And eat with joy, drink with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. Being in wisdom, you know that the good things of life are to be received with gratitude, with joy, not made, as the picture he draws here, into a life of pursuit of the pleasures of the appetites, but to be used to do the work that needs to be done. But that idea of money answers everything. He's a very practical man, Kohelet, isn't he? He's so practical, in fact, that he ends this section. Even in your thoughts, do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich. For the bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature tell the matter. Now, this is not the first time that he has given a warning about the things you say. But in this case, right, even if you think your rulers are entirely wrong, even if you believe them to be completely worthless, do not curse them. What is it we are told? Pray. Be subject. This is, of course, Romans 13, classic chapter. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Even if they are not good people, God has instituted the authority they hold. But he also says things like, pray for those in authority over you. Do you? For those who are in authority, but who do not acknowledge God's wisdom, do you pray for them? Or do you curse them in your heart? And in private, say all manner of nasty things about them. We seek the wisdom that is from God. And of course, Paul puts it very concisely. We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles, but to those who are called, both Jew and Greek, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. And he did not curse, but he blessed. He spoke the truth. This is true. And he was not afraid to call out those in authority who were unqualified for the honor. But he was not made flesh in order to create an earthly kingdom here in his own time, but to draw everyone into the kingdom of light. And his day will come. He will return. He will return victorious as king. In the meantime, we study, we learn, we grow in wisdom. And that means leaving folly behind. I would say if there's anything I've found from this section of just sort of scattered proverbial wisdom, it is basically to examine myself to see where am I still clinging to folly, to immaturity, to disobedience, because they can't coexist. And I will never reach the goal, as Paul said, the upward goal for which I strive, until I am cleansed of the folly that remains. So that, I'd say that's a good enough lesson to learn.